Number one, I'll give you a 99% chance that the housing market is not going down.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Okay.
Okay. It has gone down 2 times in the last 100 years. In the 1930s and in 2008. It's the only time it's gone down.
Okay.
And then it snapped right back almost instantaneously in the 2008. Less than a year. Even the areas like, for instance, Las Vegas was the worst hit by the bubble burst. It was overbuilt. It was the fastest growing city in America, and it basically, the bubble exploded there, and we saw values come down pretty substantially. And it was 18 months, and they were all back.
I don't know where you're getting your statistics.
And then it's gone nowhere but north since then. So I don't predict housing is going to go down at all in this round.
Okay.
I do think it's going to slow down its rate of increase, but that does defeat your premise, okay, as far as renting until then.
Now, maybe Dave Ramsey misspoke and he was saying crash. Maybe the other ones he considered not large enough drop to make a difference. But the housing market does drop nearly every 18 years, according to economist Homer Hoyt. And here's his graph that he charted from the 1800s all the way up until 2008. And as you can see, there were some times where it obviously went longer than 18 years. And there's usually government intervention or something unexpected, like World War II, Federal Reserve doubling of interest rates in 1979. There's certain things that causes crashes, and then there's certain things that causes them to not crash. Even with government intervention, world wars, and everything, it's pretty steady at 18 years, a housing market crash. In the same article, they talk about how they think it's going to be in 2026, and I'll share this article in the description below. It's one thing to say the housing market has crashed only twice in the past 100 years, which, okay, then you'd have to define crash. So if crash is 20% or more, that's one thing. But to say that it's never gone down in the past 100 years except for 2 times is just 100% factually untrue. Here's an article from the LA Times written in the year 2000 documenting the housing crash of the 1990s. I was actually living in Southern California in the early 1990s and lived through this housing crash. Our property fell about 33% in value. In the $1 million homes, it looks like they fell 40% from 1989 to 1994, which, if you have $1 million house and it drops 40%, now that same $1 million house is selling for $600,000. Well, all the houses that were selling for $600,000 obviously went down as well. They might not have gone down 40%, but they had to have come down with the $1 million homes. So if he's saying that a crash is anything over 20%, I guess San Diego would probably be the only city in Southern California that didn't suffer a crash based on that definition. But it actually did go down. Here's another website that actually documents housing prices by region, and I like how they do median and then also average. And then you can click on it, zoom in, you can see more details. This is the West region. The reason I like this is because the Midwest is obviously a lot different than the West Coast, and Manhattan is a lot different than Ohio. Up until recently, the Midwest was kind of not really a place where people were flocking to. And the reason people are flocking there is because they can work remote and the low cost of living. But up until the past couple of years, people were living, where they wanted to work and higher incomes, and, the housing prices reflected those higher incomes. So for example, if you can make $100,000 in New York, the houses also cost more in New York versus in Ohio. That same job, you might be able to make $50,000, and the housing prices are also reflective of the income in the area. I hear a lot of realtors and famous YouTubers and people like Dave Ramsey talking about how the crash in 2008, even though it was in 2006, was different because they didn't have a strict regulatory standards. If you look at the stock market, people purchase stock usually with cash that they have, 100% cash that they have. They also purchase on margin, but for the most part, I would say most people purchase stock with cash that they have. Not very many people purchase on margin. Well, look what happened a couple years ago when the pandemic started. The stock market crashed for no good reason. It was just fear. People were afraid. It wasn't because everybody was on margin and they were panicking and the banks were calling for the money and they wanted everybody to sell their stock to cover their margin. Had nothing to do with that. It was just people panicking or people losing their jobs, cashing out their retirements, whatever the case may be. Real estate is even harder because you're usually only putting 5 to 10% down, the average person. Some will do 20% down, but for most part, it's around 5, maybe 10% down. So the housing market is highly leveraged. Another reason I don't think you can necessarily look at the history of the real estate market to predict the future is because for the first time in the history of the real estate market, large corporations have been purchasing homes in bulk. As you can see in this article, Blackstone owns 12,556 homes in Atlanta. And at one point, they purchased 90% of all homes in the zip codes, some zip codes. Blackstone is just one corporation. There was also the guy that owned Public Storage who started getting into real estate. I believe when I sold my house to their corporation, they had 13,000 homes, and that was in 2012. They had already accumulated 13,000 homes then. So you have corporations owning tens of thousands of houses across the United States. Now, what happens if they want to sell a large portfolio? Do you think they have the ability to affect the pricing? I think so.
So the other thing that Dave said that was just not even remotely close to being true was that Las Vegas recovered within 18 months from the bottom to back to where the prices were. Now, I lived in Phoenix at the time when the crash started and when the crash recovered, and it still didn't even get back to where we were when 2006 prices. And I'm going to show you Las Vegas here. So this is starting from 2000. Here, I just summarized it here. So the peak was July 2006. And the average price home was $372,000. It bottomed out in April 2012 with the average price being $133,000. So it took almost 6 years to reach the bottom, which Dave Ramsey said it took 18 months to recover from 2008. It didn't even hit the bottom until 2012. So I don't know where he was getting his numbers from. And it didn't recover until 2021. It took 15 years, over 15 years to recover from the peak to get back to where you were. So if you bought a house in July 2006, you would have had to wait 15 years just to get your money back. And here you can see all the lists, and I can share this with you. So as you can see, it hasn't started to show that the prices have crashed yet, and this is probably because these are sold figures. So prices are dropping, but the sales are still. So April, those were probably under contract in March. So you should start seeing these prices drop maybe in a month or two. So here's a perfect example of a house that was down the street from us in Arizona. They sold at the peak of the market for $530,000. And then a year later, not even a year later, they sold for $500,000 as the market had already started to drop at the end of 2006. 2009, almost 2 years later, it's still almost half the price of what it was sold for. 2022, it's at $695,000. So you're telling me that it got all the way up to $530,000 within 18 months? There's no way. It took, let's see, probably 13 years, because I'll say about 2020 it was probably right around 500,000. Took about 13 years for it to recover. And this is just one example. This one was sold in 2005. This was on the same street for 934,000. Then it was sold 3 years later for 529,000. Still, it took, 625 is still not even close to what it was sold for originally. 210. Here's another one on the same street that sold for 661, and then a month later 721, but I'm assuming there was like an assignment for resale or something. So even if you took the 661, see, that was 2005. 4 years later, it's worth half. 329,800 is what it sold for. 4 years later. And then sold again in 2011 for 390. It wasn't until 2019 that it was 647, which is still less than 2005. So 14 years later, it still was not recovered from 2005 prices, and the peak was 2006. In my current house back in January, February, it was probably worth about 450 to 460, somewhere in that range. And a couple weeks ago, a house was listed that's 600 square feet larger than my house. It's 2,300, mine's at 1,700. It was listed for 440, and it's been sitting there for a couple weeks. So back in January, February, they would have probably been able to get 500,000, maybe a little bit more. But now homes that are just as nice, if not nicer, and 600 square feet bigger on the same street are selling for 440. Well, actually, it's listed for 440. It's not even sold yet.